Perfect. All right, well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us for another Expert Talks online with Equal Experts Australia and New Zealand. Today, we're lucky to be joined by Tony Nguyen, who's the Director of Transformation and Delivery at Equal Experts APAC, and he'll be discussing how organisations' funding and budgeting approach impacts its ability to innovate and deliver at speed. Tony started his career working at global software products companies and has since returned to Australia and has been helping apply these concepts to enterprise corporations, including transformations at Optus, Westpac, and CBA. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for being with us tonight. Tony, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. So let's get straight into it. So the agenda for today is actually pretty simple. We're going to talk about an example of what a traditional enterprise funding cycle looks like. So that for some of you that haven't seen it, you might be surprised, but you'll get a bit of a look. Some of you that have been involved with it, and it sounds like we've got quite a lot of people that funding happens to them. I'm sorry. We're going to look at some of the common symptoms that causes in the organization that we may not typically relate to the funding, and then we'll give you some strategies of your way out. And there's some Q&A time at the end. All right, so let's jump straight into it. One of the first questions that I ask a client when we walk in and we work with them is, how long does it take you to turn an idea into reality? And the main reason is it gives me an idea of the scale of the problem and where we can kind of dig into where their bottlenecks are. And there's a common assumption that the bottlenecks in a delivery cycle are usually in the delivery engine, and that's where they focus their effort. However, as we alluded to in the first quote in that Phoenix project, that may not be the best use of your time, energy, or money. So let me walk you through an example. So I'm going to take you back to 2013 when I was at Westpac. And Westpac, for those of you that are on distant shores, is one of Australia's largest banks in Australia. One of the first projects we ran in the retail banking area to prove that agile practices could work was a project related to cardless cash. So the premise of the cardless cash feature is if you forget your wallet or you need emergency cash and you don't actually have your card on you, that you can actually still get money out of an ATM machine by authenticating with your app. There was a lot of pressure to deliver this in a very short amount of time. And what I discovered late in the delivery cycle was that this had been a special pet project of Brian Hartz's at the time. And despite him being the retail head of the business and soon afterwards the CEO, he was unable to get it funded. So for 12 months, that project only existed behind locked doors. And in that same time frame, Westpac's rival CBA managed to have the idea, build it, and get it out to market in a matter of months. So Westpac lost that race, not because they were slow to build it, but because they were slow to fund it. So let's take a look at what a common enterprise funding cycle looks like, starting up in that yellow area. So at some stage, you have an idea. You have to sell that idea to get money. So you start building that business case. You have to actually submit that business case for funding. And if you're in some sort of business unit, that actually gets reviewed, and then so on and so forth. So this continues depending on how many layers you have in your hierarchy, potentially 6 or 7 times, until you finally get to the stage where there's an overarching finance review, funding gets approved, you get green, and you actually get that money released. Okay, that's commonly an annual cycle for a lot of organizations, and sometimes matches their financial year. What it actually is a competition for funds. So what initially appears as an investment rigor isn't. So I've seen numerous examples where the organization spends the same amount every year. So it's essentially a Game of Thrones for funds. One of the first bottlenecks is your ability to turn your ideas into reality, just like the Westpac example, is your actual ability to get funding. A lot of this is actually wasteful because a lot of the work actually in terms of generating those business cases is actually unaccounted for. That's extra work that no one is actually accounting. Or if you actually are accounting for it, you've actually got whole teams actually dedicated to just putting those business cases together. So how do we actually end up getting here? It's actually a byproduct of how we structure our organizations, and it has its roots in the manufacturing industry. So if I did a quick search on the kind of history behind this interesting description popped up. When we started segregating our organizations along those specialization lines under the premise of it was going to be fast to do a small piece of work and hand it off to the next person, it kind of works to a certain extent, but the majority of the work that we do these days is creative knowledge work, and it requires real collaboration. So when you couple that with the traditional hierarchies in our organization and how we structure our organizations, the financing of the work leads to some really interesting impacts on how we actually then do the work. So what are some of those downstream impacts in an organization that you may not realize at first glance is influenced by how we structure the business and fund it? So I've grouped those symptoms under a few topics here, and we're going to walk through examples of each of these. So the first one I see is tech is usually siloed and subservient to the business. So firstly, a confession, I spent the majority of my career at software product companies. And the first job I took after returning to Australia was at Optus, which is a large telecommunications company. So when I first heard people referring to IT and the business, it was new to me because in a product company, IT is your business. And the most common divisions in an organization that we see are usually by function, process, or geography. Sometimes it's by product or service, but that's rarer. So in this common example, the technology function sits apart from the other business units. And why is that bad? So the technology structure doesn't actually align to the revenue streams or how you generate value. So it makes it really hard to get work done. It makes it hard to deliver together. It tends to become a very customer, vendor, subservient type relationship that makes true collaboration difficult. And even within technology, there are usually silos and they're not usually structured in a way that's conducive to throughput either. The other symptom that you might see is that the priorities are unclear and cobbled together. So what do we mean by that? Not only do we actually have an annual funding cycle, the way that it's structured means that the majority of the funding is withheld into several buckets. So for example, even if you have $100 million up for grabs, that may be split out into BAU funding, divisional or business unit functions funding, and strategic funding, with the majority of it held at that top level. So what this does is you get forced composition. So if you want funds for a project, even a relatively small idea, you have to batch it up with other initiatives to get access to that strategic pot. So for example, $70 million out of that $100 million is withheld for the strategic projects. And they may actually have a barrier where the minimum spend to apply for that might be 10 million plus. So if you've got an idea that's worth about $1 million to actually build, you have to batch it up with other ideas to actually even go into the pool to actually get the money. And then you take that the next step further, is that when you actually get that funded and you actually decompose those corresponding parts into the work that needs to be done, those decomposed parts have no value anymore. So when they pass through that funding funnel and get approved, they no longer have alignment to their strategic goals. So in the image you see, you've got a whole bunch of initiatives. We've approved some through the funnel. And by the time they get broken up into the departments that are going to be working on them, they've been split into their constituent work parts or their work units. So if one of those ideas was the one that was the magic one that was going to give you all the money, you can no longer align them across all those business units. And that may just not be IT. That could be the HR or finance or other actual business units you've got that need to do the work. So when they're decomposed into the work that needs to be done, the delivery team lose sight of the piece, how the piece that they're working on relates to the specific goal. So they can no longer tell what is the next most important thing to work on. And if you're not sure if this is a problem in your organization, go ask the people on the floor and see if they know what the priority order of the work that they're working on is, and if they know why it's important. The third symptom that we sometimes see is that there are vast chasms between the concept and the value that we think the initiative is going to have. So because of that feedback loop is so long, it may be 2 years from when you first initially had the idea to when it gets into a customer's hands, and you find that it didn't have the impact that you predicted. Because so much of that funding is withheld and you're forced to compete for it, everyone is overselling those benefits. So there tends to be a lot of unvalidated assumptions and metrics in those business cases. And if you've ever tried to build an OKR, you probably know how hard it is to do well and come up with the right metrics. We also have some opportunity costs related to the way we fund things, because what else could you have built in that same time frame, or how much revenue or benefits have you lost by not getting it built fast enough? This is a common symptom and a common complaint I hear is that technology is slow. And one of the first things I want to talk about is that work is usually thrown over the fence. So remember that Westpac cardless cash example? When you look at the life cycle of an idea, it spends a lot of its time just being funded and then resourced, and then the work finally starts. So the lead time that we're measuring is probably not very fair to those delivery teams in the first place. The starters gun for the lead time should have got off when we first had the idea. So you end up with queues everywhere. The structural issues we discussed earlier leads to all these specialized teams in your organization or divisions, and each of those teams and divisions have a queue or a front door process in which you have to go through to get your work done, which makes things even slower. And a lot of enterprise organizations, we have an overemphasis on utilization. So all those specialized teams are usually internally charging each other to recoup their costs. So no one wants to run a department that loses money, and those managers tend to run their teams at 100% utilization or more. And I've seen teams that have run at 200% so that they can make up for the lean months where they don't have funding. And when you run a service, a server, or a network at 100%, We call that a denial of service attack. Well, what we've just done is we've created a denial of service attack on our own delivery capability, and we wonder why technology is slow. Another symptom that you commonly see is busy work. So I recently came off a project where there were 100 staff in the program and there were no doers. They'd funded the initiative, but because of all the internal teams that needed to be coordinated to do the work in multiple teams across the organization, they really wanted to get started. And in 12 months, they had teams just building requirements and doing what they called no regrets work that they thought could get done that they wouldn't have to redo in the future. So essentially that 100 staff were essentially coordinators. But because the work is so distributed, a common solution is to hire a lot of project managers and coordinators to run and organize them. And because there's no priority, there's no way to find out how the work was composed and decomposed. Every project manager is pushing for their piece of work to be done first in the queue. This also leads to sub-optimization because every department is doing what they can to make work easier for them, including the front door queue that we talked about earlier. So they're all crying for staff and they're all running at 100%, but nothing is actually getting through the system. And when you're at this stage, you're in trouble because you can't identify where the real bottleneck is anymore because everything is flashing red. Unplanned work. So going back to the Phoenix project, one of the most damaging types of the 4 types of work is unplanned work. And an example would be that at this stage, you're so overworked and you can't deliver what you've been asked to deliver in this financial year, yet you're being asked to provide business cases and estimates to support next financial year's funding. Or something suddenly gets escalated and marked as urgent that everyone has to down tools for. And the one I've left last as a symptom is probably the most detrimental symptom, because in a project-oriented world, your teams are temporary. You finally build and gel as a cohesive group, and then you have to break up the band and you lose all that knowledge because of the looming financial cliff. In the feast or famine nature of funding, you can't guarantee the funding is going to be there. So you have to let talent go at the end of the financial year, and then you have to try and rehire them back when the funding comes in next year. And the last one is, remember how we talked about the teams running at over 100%? You can only sustain that for so long before people leave your organization of their own accord. So we've been fairly pessimistic so far, and there are some things that we currently do that aren't ideal. How do we fix it? Simplistically, big bang funding doesn't support agile delivery of innovative ideas very well. So what you want to do is you want to try and take those agile principles and apply them at the organizational level. And notice I said principles and not practices, because there are dangers in blindly applying agile practices without understanding the purpose and the intent. And there are too many companies at the moment that are organizing into tribes and running stand-ups instead of steering committees, and they don't understand why they're doing it, and they wonder why they're not seeing the improvements. So let's take a look at some alternative approaches, which I've grouped into 4 themes. And when you're trying to work out what strategies you put in place or what you can try, it kind of depends on where you were on that sliding scale of how influential you are to this process. So if you have more influence, try the stuff on the left. If you have less, try some of the stuff on the right. So let's start with alignment. Probably the biggest thing you can do, if there was one thing, and if you have the capacity to do it, is to simplify your structure. So the clearest, straightest line you have between how you make money and how you spend it makes it much simpler to deliver outcomes. So for example, I once had a team that built an asset management product, and I knew exactly how much revenue that asset product brought in. I knew how much it cost me for the teams to build and support it. And then the question quickly became, is that an appropriate investment ratio for the year? And the next step is, well, if it is, then it's a prioritization exercise of what the next most important thing is for the team to build. When we talk about wanting persistent funding, what we really mean is wanting persistent teams, because that's what's buying you. So don't break up the band every year. Structure your teams into divisions that can be independent, make them cross-functional, get rid of the queues, and bring the work to them. Push the funding decisions down. Get it closer to the customer and where the customer knowledge is, rather than trying to have it centralized by some investment board. And improve the loops in the hierarchy, because now that we're pushing those investment decisions down further, the context also has to go down so they can make the informed decisions. Transparency also has to go up so you have a better handle on what's really happening in your organization. If you can't make those structural changes, experiment. Find one area where it can work. So in quite a few large banks, a lot of their money comes from credit card schemes. So if you're in a credit card business, one of the ways the banks make money is they actually sell off the branding rights to their credit cards. And that's MasterCard, Visa, Amex, etc. And that's usually a multi-year contract. So they know that they've got dedicated funding in that area. So that's one area you could potentially hive off where you know you could get participant funding and then actually utilize that money in that way. The second thing you can try to experiment with is just try and simplify those business cases, because I've seen some that look like novels. Try a lean canvas. A few years ago, we created an internal playbook that the teams used, and we had a play in there that was actually called kick off or kill. Essentially, you want to make the decision to kill an initiative or kick it off pretty quickly, and ideally based on data. And speaking of learning from data, look to take smaller bets. I don't want to get too much into this one because there's a great blog post from my colleague, Dave Cox. So there's a link there for you guys to go and grab that. But you're essentially looking for ways to make small bets instead of being all in on your initiatives. Atomize. So if you're concerned about governance, it still exists, but the controls look different. So look for opportunities to fund an area and then release it in smaller increments and tranches. We're trying to break down that feast or famine nature of the funding while still giving enough reassurance to the area that they are being funded. And we want to get rid of some of those harmful symptoms that we discussed previously that occur because of that. I've seen a lot of organizations have success with doing this quarterly. It seems to be a right-sized planning window that most people are comfortable with. A large part of the agile practices is trusting the teams, but still having regular points in time for inspecting, learning, and adapting. This still needs to occur at an organizational level. So you wouldn't just give $5 million to your builder to go build something and then walk away. You want to continually go check on that investment. And that means going to the site and talking to the workers and the project manager, not actually just looking at a red, amber, or green progress report. And one of the last ways that you can actually approach this is if you can't do it, then you try and reverse engineer it. So let me give you the example of digital at CBA. So for about 7 years there, from about 2012 to 2019, the digital division at CBA was able to sustain about 50 persistent cross-functional teams. Persistent in that they didn't get torn down every year and for each initiative. So the work was brought to the teams instead of the teams being brought to the work. A lot of this was done without dedicated funding and was cobbled together from internal financial wizardry, and they essentially reverse engineered the funding they needed to sustain those teams from the traditional corporate funding process that a bank has. The caveat to this is that takes a lot of work. So there were people dedicated to that just to actually make that happen. And importantly, once you've done that, you need to protect it. It hung around for 7 years because there was some senior leaders that backed it and really stood in the way to make sure that it kept working. So after all that, there is no silver bullet though, because it's a mindset shift in two ways. It's firstly how we think about solving the problem, and secondly about how we actually solve the problem. So we're going to throw you back into Slido for a second. If you want to pull out your phones and grab your QR codes, and humor me for a second, because this is a two-part question. All right, so nothing wrong with the mathematics here. I'm hoping that that was a joke. We might move on to the next question now. All right, next question. This may be close to home for a lot of you. I'm currently in Sydney and we've been locked down since June. So it gave me an opportunity to vent some of that using the poll. Alrighty, that's actually more of a split than I thought. So there actually is no right answer because it's actually a combination of both. You would like to give your kids something that matches their interests as well as something that's equal so they don't fight about it, right? So we are unfortunately a product of our education where we're raised to think that there is a simple black and white or an either or answer to a lot of questions, mainly because we're tested and that's how we were tested. So I'm going to introduce you to a model called the polarity model, right? And then we're going to apply it to our funding dilemma. So we're going to start with a breathing example. So it's not a either or, should you inhale or exhale. So if we start on the top left, you take a breath in, you get oxygen. After a while, you start getting too much carbon dioxide. You have to follow that loop to the other side. You have to exhale and clear out that carbon dioxide. But after a while, you start dropping down, you get too little oxygen. You have to start breathing again. So it's a continuous loop, right? So we're going to take that and actually apply that to what we're talking about here. So I see many organizations running transformation programs that keep them in this infinite loop. They spend time in a few years in one state, they get frustrated, and then they start transitioning to the other side. It's great for management consultants, but it's really expensive and really disruptive. So say you currently do have a traditional centralized funding cycle. What do? How do you escape that crazy game? So the first thing you do is recognize the value of where you are. So yes, there is a benefit to having a clear chain of command and better system integration. But recognize the legitimate concern that too much decentralization could lead to silos and duplication and tech debt like fragmented systems. Right? So acknowledge that there actually are legitimate concerns there. But then raise the question of, well, how do you get the benefits of having those autonomous business units while holding on to the benefits of actually having that centralization so you can actually be competitive? All right, they're not mutually exclusive. So pre-COVID, back when we could actually travel, I was happily floating on a boat in Halong Bay in Vietnam. I bumped into a South African couple also on holidays, and they were from Cape Town. And as we chatted, the conversation turned to their recent drought. And I'm not sure if you remember the water crisis that they went through from 2015 to 2018, but Cape Town faced becoming the first major city in the world to run out of drinkable water. There's a quick video here on it.
Take very short showers, and it's not a old shower, it's a trickle coming out of the shower.
So for 2 years, they tried various water restrictions and the levels continued to drop, and the usage from the population didn't change as they expected. Then they started a campaign where they started referring to the day the water would be turned off as day zero. And the couple recounted to me that the dramatic behavior change they saw amongst the population when they started treating that water as a precious resource. And it got me thinking, when we think about funding, we can pray for rain, or we can flip the mindset and behave like the capacity of our teams and our people is a precious and limited resource, and we should use it wisely. And then it becomes less about how we fund work and more about what work is actually important to us. And if you don't think that you have talented teams of people, that's a totally different talk. That is it for today. Thank you for joining us. Matt, you want to pop up and let's answer some questions from people?
Yeah, actually, before jumping into the questions, I kind of want to address, so we recently had an expert talk with Karim Zuri, who's the CEO of Cascade, and the crux of that talk was really about how do you generate strategies that work to encourage and to cultivate innovation. Whereas this talk sort of was more aligned with sustaining innovation. Do you want to sort of talk about those two, the differences in those two factors and how both of them obviously play into innovation, but one of them is about that continued capability to do it and to sort of encompass it versus the actual initiation of creating innovation in the first place?
Yeah, so there are a couple of techniques here that cross over. So one is when you get that idea, and I recommend Karim's talk highly, is go and listen to that. Those small bets, learning as you go, kicking off and killing ideas, learning from data, all that sort of stuff is still true. But a lot of what we're talking about here is how do you, as a larger organization, sustain that innovation? Say you're actually alive and you're doing well, but now you're struggling and you can't actually get the throughput and the speed that you used to, and everyone's complaining and you're seeing some of those symptoms that we talked about. That was more what we were targeted for. Having said that though, if you're a small organization, a startup or a scale up, still handy to see, because you might be in that, when we look at those quadrants, you might be on that right side and you actually may want to shift to the left. You may actually find that you're actually very siloed and your systems are fragmented in your business units and divisions, and you actually need to start pulling some of that together. So how do you actually do that? Do you create centers of excellence or chapters where people can actually get together across the organization to fix that sort of stuff? So it's kind of beneficial to both sides.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. We did get a question from Abhishek, who said, Kia ora, people. Estimation and budgeting, I'm guessing this is someone coming from across the ditch. Estimation and budgeting has an underlying assumption about the certainty of plans and deliverables. This doesn't look very well aligned to agile methodology. What's your thoughts on that?
When you've actually got those persistent teams, it makes it much easier to estimate because you kind of know what they've done before, and then you can apply the same agile principles that you do like at a story point level or at a project or story level, apply that at an organization. So how I do strategic estimation is, have we done something that's similarly complex before? How long did that take us and how much money did that take us? And that's your estimate, right? That's roughly right. And you don't have to spend months doing a bottom-up estimation. And if the purpose of it is prioritization, it's enough.
Yeah, right. And I think one of the things that was interesting, and you definitely raised it as one of the key elements, is sort of the retaining the talent and also sort of keeping that, I guess, the motivation in the teams. Do you find that if the funding is done appropriately and there's sort of that mindset shift, then that 100% workload is less, I guess, negatively impactful on those teams, that from the top down, that this actually encourages a sort of a longer sustained environment of enjoyment in sort of delivering in these tasks and these projects?
Yeah, I do. I've been in quite a few large organizations now, and the ones where they've actually been managed to structure themselves into those business units that are more aligned to their revenue streams do a lot better because they have everything they need. If it's not in the team, then at least it's in the group and it's close by, so they don't have to sit in lots of queues. Otherwise, you spend most of your time doing busy work.
We've had a question from Bree Campbell. Where rolling wave is being used for planning, what known funding strategies, which are commonly accepted in business, can be employed?
Sorry, I'm just going to have to take another look at that question.
Sorry?
That is a much bigger question, Peter. You want to ping me offline and we can go through some of the stuff there because some context would actually help with that.
We've got one that's just come in. How do you get a massive organization to transition towards this approach? And understandably, it's a big question, but I guess if we were looking at it in small milestones or in small pieces, what have you seen as a great first step towards taking that larger enterprise on this journey that you've seen as a success and well adopted by those stakeholders?
So we talked briefly about some of them. So if you're just starting out, trying to find one area where you can try it out. So finding an area where, and sometimes it may not be even in technology, where you can actually go, hey, there's a place here that actually has dedicated funding all the time, or at least dedicated funding that we can try this out. The second one is that reverse engineering process where you may not be able to actually get dedicated, but you can actually put a process around it to protect an area and try and create it there. Finding one leader that's also feeling the same pain and is senior enough to actually champion that with you. Taking those leaders, so this is done by most product companies, this is why they have less trouble with this, is take them on a tour. Like there's a lot of the times when you can't influence internally, and taking them on that's annoying, but you take them on that whirlwind tour of Silicon Valley and they see what's there and they see all the bright, shiny things that they want. And then all of a sudden their mindsets change a little bit. The alternative is you bring in really expensive consultants and they sometimes listen to them more than they listen to you, unfortunately, as well.
Awesome. Donna Boyd obviously has enjoyed what you've presented. There was a question to see if this would be available following this session, but I think as well, it's worth mentioning if there is things that anyone who listened to this would like to dive into further, definitely reach out to Tony or myself. The links and contact details are available on the screen at the moment. But this is something we'd love to get a more intimate understanding of what you're facing and your challenges are, and pull some of those insights out of Tony's brain and curate them for the challenges that you're facing. Just making sure, see if anything else has come up here. Yep. Many times startups fail to estimate budgets accurately. The startup is about to make a mistake of either underfunded or overfunded. Which one would be preferable?
Oh, geez. I'd always want the problem of having too much money, but that's a bit of a cheap answer because every organization I've ever seen thinks they have a money problem, including the banks that spend $1 billion every year. And actually what's interesting is COVID has actually taught us that the money problem we thought we had is actually a talent problem, because now that our borders are shut, Australia particularly is struggling. Right? And people have money and they still can't get their work done. So look, I'd rather have more money, but I'd rather have the talent.
Do you think, just following on to that question, the right culture in this regard and sort of having those stakeholders in this mindset would actually be conducive with attracting the right people as well? Like, do you find that it sort of transcends outside the organization, that when these things are in place, that sort of is something that people can see or feel when they're considering whether to come into a team or to be part of, an organization?
I think so. Mainly because of that, when we talk about that financial cliff and when people aren't happy, they leave, you can usually tell if people are leaving and there's an exodus, and people talk. It's a small industry. So you'll know ahead of time if there are a whole bunch of people going, you start asking why. And if a lot of it's because they're doing busy work, or if they're not being valued, then that gets around. So yeah, that top level culture comes through.
Yeah, awesome. The questions are coming in thick and fast now. We've opened the floodgates. How do you build this agile funding into our enterprise portfolio model?
Oh, is that Nikki?
That's Nikki.
You threw me under the bus with that one. Where do you start with that? The portfolio model is built on, I guess, the way we structure our projects at the moment. So if your portfolios are more structured around that products or the services you provide, you have less of that top level enterprise that you need to manage, if that makes sense. So you back away from, we're holding all this money at a portfolio level, and you actually disperse it to those actual business units that are delivering the end value chain and let them handle it, right? Then there's a little bit of oversight, but it's less enterprisey, and everyone has to actually roll everything up here and all the decisions are made at the top. And it's more about the actual business units or divisions actually running their own P&L and actually making sure they get the outcomes that they need to. That's the simplistic answer. Not easy to get to.
Awesome. We've got from Pip, is our ability to influence the mindset shift in leadership the real problem here?
It's a part of the problem, but they're people too, right? So I have empathy for the things that C-level people have to deal with. Having been an executive at CBA, I spent most of my time firefighting, right? So 95% of the day was just putting out fires. So being able to strategically think about changing things and actually moving on, that's tough. Right? So in terms of how you actually help with that is your ability to influence is you have to be really clear with the time that you've got with an executive or someone senior. So I think, what's a common phrase? I'm trying to think of the phrase that I say is that the scarcest resource today is executive attention. So you got to be really clear about your value proposition and what the problem you have and what you need help with in the time that you have them. Yeah, it's tough. Like, we could just easily say if all the execs and all the C-level people understood this, would be golden. But the structures that we're talking about have been in place for 50, 60, 70 years. It's how big corporates are structured. It's how they're governed. It's how boards expect them to be governed. So there's a lot there to unravel. It's all tightly intertwined.
We've got kind of two parts to follow on from that. One of them being, do you think COVID has increased that appetite for changing the way things are done?
Yeah, because it's forced a hand. Like trying to get employers to actually just let employees work remotely was tough earlier, and now it's much easier. Funding, the question about whether it's actually affected startup funding, not my area. We work with startups and scale-ups, and they have money, and they're struggling to get talent. So I don't know if it's actually helped or impacted funding.
Awesome. Well, I think from just doing a quick take over the chat, I think that just about covers all the questions that have come up in there. Is there any sort of nuggets of Tony Insight Gold that you'd like to leave us with? And yeah, I'll leave it to you and then I'll wrap it up.
Find somewhere to start. Like, start small. Find even if you can't find an area that you think you can actually generate that dedicated funding, is try and get those cross-functional teams. That gets rid of the queues, at least in your own team. Try and get those cross-functional divisions or business units or whatever you call them internally. So even if you don't have, so what we're seeing in work in the past is, even though there's a centralized HR function or a finance function or a security function, anything that's specialized, if you can get a dedicated resource, at least just for your business unit or area, so you don't have to go wait in the queue elsewhere, that helps, right? It's all the queuing that's actually causing all the detrimental queues and time delays. So look for that. Look for an opportunity to make a start.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you, Tony, for being a part of tonight's ETO and for sharing those insight with us. I think there's going to be some follow-up emails coming your way for people to have deeper chats with you and a few more questions, which is great. That's the point of these sessions, is to sort of bring a community together to raise some interesting topics and to open some discussions. So thank you everyone who attended, got involved, interacted with it. I won't name names on the person that said 3 + 3 was 9, but we can see that from our end. No, I'm joking, we can't. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining. There will be another expert talk towards the end of October, so keep an eye out for that on our LinkedIn or on our website, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next one. Thank you. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, everyone.